Well, welcome everybody to this evening's Royal Historical Society lecture. My name's Emma Griffin, I'm the President of the Royal Historical Society, and I'm delighted to welcome new and old faces here to Mary Ward House tonight, as well, of course, our audience joining online. Tonight it's my great pleasure to introduce the second Royal Historical Society lecture of our 2024 programme. Our lecture series runs throughout the year and includes leading historians, such as Julia here, who speak about a wide range of new research covering the medieval, early modern and modern periods. I'm particularly delighted to welcome Julia Late to speak about her latest work tonight. Julia is a Professor of History at Birkbeck University. Her research focuses on the history of women and gender, crime and criminal justice, and more recently on settler colonialism, migration and creative history. And it's been really influential for many of us working in the field can testify how much we've learned from Julia's work and how much we draw upon it. Her latest work examines colonialism, peacemaking, family history and storytelling in her home of Newfoundland. It's a topic she's going to discuss with us this evening. She's the author of several books, including Common Prostitutes and Ordinary Citizens of 2011, Wolfenden's Women, Prostitution in Post-War Britain, 2019, and most recently, the hugely successful The Disappearance of Lydia Harvey, 2021, which won the Crime Writers Association Gold Dagger for Non-Fiction and the Burt Roth Award for Labour History. Her lecture tonight, she's going to be speaking on possible maps, ways of knowing, and my eyes are giving up on me, on Unknowing on the Edge of Empire, Newfoundland, 1763 to 1829. Please join me in welcoming Julia tonight. Thank you.
I'm going to wait till the slides come up. Thank you so much for inviting me to the RHS and to everyone for coming and to everyone who's online, who I can't see, but hello. And before I begin, I just wanted to say that, a brief content note, this lecture does contain descriptions of racialized violence. Excellent. I'm going to wait to hide the floating meeting controls, whatever that means. So the title of this talk is an homage to the play Possible Maps by Newfoundland playwright Ed Rich, which I saw many years ago now. And it recounts the story of a geographer who descends slowly into madness whilst attempting to chart the interior of Newfoundland. And he produces an encoded map with transposed coordinates, which renders it unusable and causes two hunters to get terribly lost. And it felt like a very apt metaphor for some of the things I'm going to be discussing today. And despite its title, and while it draws a little on the vast scholarship on mapping, this talk really isn't about cartography or the history of maps. The use of map in this lecture, to quote Matthew Edney, is underspecified and does not imply any normative idealization. And as Tim Ingold reminds us, mapping and wayfaring are not the same thing. And wayfaring tells us that however good our map, we know as we go, not before we go. Stories are much the same. So in this talk, I will show you 4 possible maps and tell 4 overlapping and entangled stories, set in relatively the same place, the island of Newfoundland, in particular the northwest coast and its riverine interior. The idea is that we might lay them, that is the maps and the stories, on top of each other like transparencies, and that this palimpsest might assist us in wayfinding through a complex and entangled history. Or at least that's the idea. We'll see if it works. Where do I point? Maybe I'll just say, new slide, please. In 1763, Captain James Cook, who was better known for other charts, set out in Her Majesty's schooner Grenfell to chart the coastline of the island of Newfoundland accurately for the first time. With the famed naturalist Joseph Banks on board, Cook's task was to map the island's 6,000 miles of rocky coastline, the 7,000 islands that lay offshore, and the depth of the waters between them. Newfoundland was Britain's oldest overseas colony, claimed for the English crown ever since European vessels had discovered its incredible fishing grounds in the late 15th century. Other European countries were also exploiting its waters at this point, and whether Terre-Neuve to the French, Terra Nova to the Portuguese, Newfoundland to the Dutch, sorry for my pronunciation, Newfoundland was the first apocryphal story this nation overseas empires told. But to the Irish, who supplied the majority of the indentured labor for the British enterprise there, the island was simply Talamamaish, or land of fish. It was the better name. Newfoundland's Grand Bank, a shallow ocean shelf that stretched more than 36,000 square miles off the northeast and southeast coast. New slide, please, unless this is working now. It is not. It is not. Off the northeast and southeast coast, was the richest fishing ground for cod in the world. For 5 centuries, the Newfoundland Grand Bank fishery would remain the largest single fishery on the planet. On early maps, the Grand Bank, or Grand Banque to the French, looms larger than the island itself. These shallow lands, which Paul Holm has evocatively called the alien and unseen world below water, appear significantly more important than the land beside it. West Country merchants knew how to turn that fish into wine through the machinations of the triangle trade. From the late 16th century onward, men and boys would sign on as indentured servants in ports around the West Country and the southeast of Ireland. They were then shipped in crews of 10 or 20 on sailing vessels to Newfoundland, where they traded their labor, their freedom, and sometimes their lives for the promise of good and steady pay for 2 summers and a winter in between. They would work in small boats from late spring until late summer, catching and processing cod, which was salted and spread across fish flakes on the foreshore, where it would dry in the summer wind and sun, producing, at an incredible scale, a high-protein food that had a very long shelf life. And this is an example of a later style of fish flake, but it gives you a sense of what they were, platforms to dry fish on. Some people stayed over the winter, forming a necklace of informal settlements around the coast, and over time, these settlements spread and grew. As Paul Holm argues, the fish revolution and the development of salt cod as a commodity is, quote, grossly underestimated, under-researched, and indeed little appreciated as a major event in the history of resource utilization and globalization. Despite its status as an unfashionable commodity, salt cod quietly fueled the spread of an immense empire and underscored the birth of a capitalist economic system. By the later 16th century, writes Newfoundland historian Peter Pope, European commercial activity in Atlantic Canada exceeded, in volume and value, European trade with the Gulf of Mexico. The early modern fishery at Newfoundland was an enormous industry for its time and even for our own, end quote. By the early 19th century, when the fishery reached its pre-industrial height, over 1 million quintals of Newfoundland cod, or 123 million pounds of fish, were being exported annually from the island. Cod didn't just get turned into wine, it also got turned into sugar. The worst grade of cod, as Eric Williams put it, fish that was fit for no other human consumption, was used to feed the enslaved on sugar plantations, constituting, as historians like James Cando and Cynthia Kennedy estimate, over 80% of the protein consumed by enslaved people on most plantations in the British Caribbean. The vast majority of this salt cod came from Newfoundland. Despite the growth of informal settlement and the development of local communities and culture, which I could give a whole other lecture about, Newfoundland was seen as more of a work camp than a colony. The island, to those who sat in their mahoganied offices in London and their mansions in Poole, was, in the words of Patrick O'Flaherty, a subcolonial fishing berth, an outlying cod abattoir. Newfoundland was considered very important, but not as a planted colony. Atlantic world historian Jerry Bannister argues that Newfoundland is linked to other extractive spaces of the so-called First Empire, like the Caribbean and the far north, where, quote, extreme specialization of the cod fishery, sugar, and fur meant the merchants could emerge as robber barons with little competition or checks on their power. New slide, please. As environmental historian Michael Gunther writes, places like Newfoundland constituted a vision of empire that revolved around the single-minded extraction of resources. And a desolate colony like Newfoundland had not failed to evolve into a mature and populous society. Rather, it represented a successful example of an extractive zone that yielded valuable commodities with few responsibilities or costs. And I am leaving out a huge part of this story, which is the involvement of the French Empire in the Newfoundland fishery, and how fascinating Newfoundland is as an intra-imperial space. But to make up for it, here is a bonus French map of Newfoundland and some recommended reading. It was the conclusion of the 7 Years' War in British favor that prompted Governor Thomas Graves to issue Cook's orders in 1763 in order to chart what had been the French shore. The area was so poorly known that, as Olaf Johnson notes, it had been described by one navigator in the early 18th century as like walking blindfolded and barefoot in a room of jagged glass. Cook took soundings, named waterways and islands, marked X's where rocks lay dangerously in the unseen world beneath the water. Another slide, please. It was the local fishermen who informed Cook about where these rocks were, where the shoals lurked, winds sheared, and dangerous currents churned. Unless they were part of the merchant marine, which would have taken them from Dakar to Lisbon to Kingston, these fishermen's worlds were very small indeed. Just one side of one bay with all the coves and inlets and cliff faces, named and triangulated as fishermen's marks that allowed them to return to the spots where the cod gathered, thousands of fish thick on submarine plateaus. Cook and Lane's chart was made while increasing numbers of English and Irish people were informally settling the northwestern coast of the island, in the coves and inlets on the main island, and upon hundreds of smaller ones offshore, which allowed them to be closer to the fishing grounds. Settlement spread from Trinity Bay, so that's this one here, to Bonavista Bay, to the Bay of Notre Dame over the course of the 18th century. And by the mid-18th century, Notre Dame Bay, you can click, there we go, that's the Bay of Notre Dame, or Notre Dame Bay, or NDB, as it's sometimes called. And the ocean inlets, islands, and smaller bays that comprised it was home to a few thousand, mostly poor, indentured settlers who worked under the thumbs of merchants and wealthy planters who had expanded to the area from their bases further east. River and Bay of Exploits, wrote Cook and Lane on their chart, seemingly without any sense of irony. And I think if you click again now, you'll see River and Bay of Exploits there. The river Exploits, its tributaries, watershed, and river mouth, was the heartland of Beothuk territory, and its exploitation by colonizers was disastrous for them. The Beothuk had been resisting the occupation of their seacoasts for 3 centuries. In earlier periods, whites were a temporary problem. Most of them got the hell off the island during the winter and left their stuff behind. There was no need to risk violent encounters through trade. The Beothuk simply waited until the great convoy of fishing ships had sailed east in late October, abandoning the fishing rooms that had been constructed the spring before. The Beothuk would then burn the damn things down, salvaging the iron nails for fish hooks and arrowheads for fish hooks and arrowheads, and sailcloth for mametique covers. The guts of ticking watches became necklaces. Steel traps became harpoons. Later, as more whites stayed all year round, the Beothuk improved their navigation so that they could use the frequent heavy fog to hide from the small boats, brigs, and schooners that fished and patrolled the coastal waters. They used sophisticated canoe skills, bark maps, and other wayfinding techniques to reach the islands of the Great Auk, whose eggs were of vital sustenance. Even Cook's chart, ignorant of such journeys, you can click again, can tell us just how epic they were. And you can click again. The Beothuk canoe was unique amongst all North American canoes because of its central keelson, which created an almost perfect V in the water. And these canoes had to be stabilized with a lot of rock ballast, and they were fast, agile, and beautiful, but extraordinarily tricky. Nobody would be able to get in them without knowing how to use them and getting tipped into the water. This is the craft that Beothuk egg hunters used to cover over 40 miles of open ocean, all the way out to what the whites called the Funk Islands, which in the mid-18th century had colonies of auks, murres, and gannets many millions strong. The Beothuk had no interest in cod. It was a lean, deep-water ground fish that they had no means or motivation to get. Their crucial resources were caribou, pelagic fish species like salmon, smelt, and capelin, seabirds, both their meat and their eggs, and seal, which came close to shore with the ice flows in the early spring. New slide. The immense ice floes confounded set cartographies, changing shape by the day, arriving one year and not the next. It took a careful reading of the seasons and the non-human world to know when and where and whether the seals would come. And it meant that clever and extensive food caching and food storage techniques were crucial to the survival of the Beothuk people. And again, by the time Cook and Lane made their chart, the merchants and planters who had invaded Beothuk territory had figured out that their annual quintals of salt cod could be handsomely subsidized with tierces of salmon and pelts and oil from seals. The salmon weirs began to stretch about 40 miles upriver, dramatically affecting the number of salmon that could spawn. The commercial salmon fishery went from 1,000 tierces in the 1730s to 2,000 by that century's close, almost 1 million pounds of fish per year. The ice hunt, that's what the annual seal hunt was known as, grew from 30,000 pelts per year in 1780 to 690,000 pelts per year in 1822. The great auk, the most important animal in Beothuk cosmology, was hunted to extinction around 1800, mostly for feathers and bait. The Beothuk did their best to withstand the ruin of their world. Theft and sabotage, the people's chief and largely peaceful modes of protest, became the pretext for reprisals marked by horrific and asymmetrical violence. Groups of planters and their posses of indentured servants would go in search of Beothuk camps to revenge some minor theft, armed to the teeth and more than willing to open fire into a mametique. It did not take many of these cruel humans, and there weren't that many cruel humans, to cause immense harm, not least because they also often destroyed or raided Beothuk food stores, which, as the settlers knew all too well, meant a death sentence for many dozens of people who depended on them in order to bridge the hungry gap in what passed for spring in this subarctic climate. There's often still snow on the ground this time of year. Some of the more humane naval officers who had been put in charge of law and order in the late 18th century began to wring their hands. As the island's indigenous population clearly dwindled, fingers, as they were on other bloody frontiers, were pointed at the motley bunch of poor indentured settlers. In 1768, the same year that Captain James Cook left to navigate across the Pacific, John Cartwright, a British naval lieutenant on the Newfoundland station, begged the colonial office to act. On the part of the English fishers, it is an inhumanity which sinks them far below the level of savages, he wrote to the Earl of Bathurst, then colonial secretary. The wantonness of their cruelties toward the poor wretches has frequently been almost incredible. The fishermen are much greater savages than the Indians themselves. Another local official begged Bathurst to bring about, quote, an end to hostilities between our savages and the native savages of this island. These pleas were met with virtually no response from the British government. No patrols were sent to stop the violence, no Indian country was created, no Indian agent was dispatched, no trading post established, no missionaries were sent to contact the Beothuk. Instead, inexpensive proclamations were made, threatening anyone who killed a Red Indian, as they were known, with the king's very distant justice, and declaring anyone who brought a living one to the governor would receive a reward of 50 pounds, then later 100 pounds, thereby incentivizing violent kidnaps. While Cook and Lane painstakingly marked every rock below the surface and sketched the shapes of every tiny island, the particular brand of negligent, extractive colonialism practiced in Newfoundland, that kind with few responsibilities or costs, continued to devastate the Beothuk people. Next slide, please. Map 2. As a new century of more organized knowledge gathering and imperial discovery for science dawned, interest in the Beothuk began to grow. Not enough to warrant any major expedition, to be fair, but enough to dispatch one naval lieutenant, David Buchan, and 26 Marines upriver in the winter of 1811. Leaving his schooner, the HMS Adonis, on the 13th of January, Lieutenant Buchan and his men dragged sleds laden with food, guns, ammunition, rum for themselves, and gifts for the Indians. Red cloth and copper kettles, cast iron, beads, and knives. Strapping snowshoes, or Indian rackets, as they called them, to their boots, Buchan and his men trekked for days across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, navigating half-frozen, half-thawed lakes and rivers, where the parameters of passable and impassable landscape could change by the minute. The going was so rough that Buchan was forced to abandon most of the gifts and the sleds and supplies at one of their overnight camps before pressing on. They were met with initial success when they arrived. Surprising, that's Buchan's words, new slide please, 70 Beothuk people in their winter camp by the largest lake in the interior, known to whites as Red Indian Lake, and known to the Beothuk by a name that has been lost forever. They had what Buchan called a friendly exchange. Buchan managed to convey that he wanted some Beothuk men to accompany him back to the camp where he had left the rest of the gifts. And he left 2 Marines behind, Private James Butler and Corporal William Boothland, as a gesture of goodwill, kind of hostage exchange. After a day's walk, Buchan and the rest of the party reached the earlier campsite and showed the men the gifts they had left there. But the Beothuk men began acting strangely. Buchan grew worried as the party fought their way back through to the lake through sleet and blowing snow, where they found, to their horror, the headless bodies of Butler and Boothland, naked on the lake ice. Buchan hightailed it out of there, forbidding his men from seeking the revenge they were howling for. And the men finally saw their schooner on the 30th of January, 1811. Their legs were swollen, their feet were raw, and their skin was purple with frostburn. One Marine, John Weatherall, had become deranged in mind and had to have a guard placed over him. Buchan managed to sketch out a map through all of this. He marked the places where he and his men lit their fires, noted the Beothuk storehouses along the riverside, the paths he had noticed, and the wigwams where we found the natives. Next slide. Between the literal and figurative lines on the map lay broken sledges, headless bodies, deranged minds. The map and his lengthy account of the mission highlight the material conditions of these expeditions and how arduous and catastrophic they could be, which, as Sarah Caputo writes, undermined both power dynamics and power narratives. And Buchan's long narrative of this is extremely interesting to read. Buchan intended to return, to try again for a friendly discourse with the Beothuk, but the War of 1812 scuppered his plans. The governor redirected the HMS Adonis to lead the dangerous convoy of fishing vessels that traveled back to England that October to protect it from the American threat. Sorry, I said the wrong name of the ship, but that's immaterial. It wasn't until 1820 that Buchan would return to so-called Red Indian Lake again, for a reason he could not, back in 1811, have possibly imagined. So in 1818, a group of Beothuk, engaging in a common resistance tactic, had hidden beneath the wharf of a wealthy local planter in the Bay of Exploits, who owned dozens of salmon stations inland along the Exploits River. John Peyton was his name. In the dead of night, the Beothuk raiding party stole sailcloth, fishing tackle, and John Peyton's grandfather's watch. They cut a salmon skiff loose that was laden with salmon, causing it to drift out into the bay. Peyton went to the governor, Charles Hamilton, and got permission to lead a party of his men, trappers and fishermen and salmon weir watchers, to Red Indian Lake to retrieve his things and ostensibly open up a friendly discourse with the Indians. No one appeared to question the diametrically opposing missions here. In January of 1819, John Peyton and his men, who were well known to the Beothuk, snuck up on their lakeside encampment. The Beothuk fled, but one young woman fell behind. She had just given birth 2 days before. She passed her baby to one of her kin before stumbling and falling and being captured by Peyton and his men. Her husband tried to retrieve her, first pleading with the whites in his own language, and then trying to physically get her back. After a brief struggle, he was murdered with a white man's hatchet and another's rifle. Afterward, the woman, whom the whites called Mary March after the month of her capture, was taken back to a white settlement. Here, she curled up in a ball on her bed most days, between her interviews with curious whites. During these months of capture, she provided a list of Red Indian words to her captors, which included her real name, Demasduit, and for the first time, the name her people called themselves, Beothuk. The hope was that she would learn enough English to be able to act as an emissary. She could return to her people and convince the Beothuk of white people's friendly intentions. In the white settlement where she was held captive, Demasduit contracted tuberculosis. She grew so ill that people began to fear she would be dead before she could tell the Beothuk how friendly white people were. So they called in David Buchan, newly returned from Franklin's Spitsbergen expedition, where he had captained the HMS Dorothea and tried not to get eaten by polar bears. That's actually true. With the command of the HMS Grasshopper this time, Buchan was to bring Demasduit back to the lake. But she died on board his ship, which was moored at the bottom of the Bay of Exploits on the 8th of January, 1820. A few days later, Buchan began his second trek up the frozen river. This time, his men pulled a coffin. A far better map, which is now at the UK Hydrographic Office, came out of this second mission. The very first European map to accurately chart the tangle of lakes and ponds and rivers and bogs that shaped the watery world of the Newfoundland interior, laid out on the page like a nervous system. But however much Buchan and his superiors viewed the job of imperial map making as different from the practical necessities of wayfinding as a human in the world, this map is full of waymarks and stories. It marks the Indian paths that tell us that the Beothuk were still regularly accessing the coast long after they were supposed to have retreated into the interior, relaying a history of a place that, far from a terra nullius, was inhabited and known. Buchan drew the trappers' tilts that encroached into Beothuk's territory, where terrified white men spent the winters alone with their fingers on their duck guns' triggers. He sketched out the wigwams, as Buchan called them. Mamatiques is the Beothuk word. Like many other imperial maps, the names he gave to small places reflect the experiences and feelings of the men who made them. The spots where they rested and where they ate, their encounters with the more than human world, and the literal emotional landscape they inhabited. Disappointment Point, Point Misfortune, Point Horrid, and Point Anxiety. Think he was trying to tell us something? But the map's longest story, with the most writing and the most marks, is this one. Wigwam Cove, where the natives were found by Captain Buchan in 1812, which is a date mistake. Wigwam Point, where the natives were found by Mr. Peyton in 1819. A red flag marks the place where Demasduit's husband, whose name was Nonosabasut, was murdered. And finally, with hatching showing the way the elevated structure was made from thin spruce logs, Indian's Grave. This was the place where Buchan found the grave of Nonosabasut, as well as his small infant child. Both were surrounded by the grave goods they would need for their journey to the Happy Island, the Beothuk afterlife. Containers of birch bark sewn with spruce roots, arrows and carved antler pendants, a model canoe, a dress rubbed in red ochre, a doll. Buchan placed Demasduit's coffin in this sepulchre and left. He would not return to Red Indian Lake again. Third map. Buchan's map became an official hydrographic survey, filling in a small corner of the empty expanse that was the Newfoundland interior on the chart Cook and Lane produced more than 50 years before. But it wasn't just officially sanctioned missions that contributed to the knowing of the outlying cod abattoir. The imperial world had hundreds of young men, minor merchants and aspiring natural scientists, who wished to make a name for themselves by naming other places. One of these was William Epps Cormack, a man who deserves a lecture of his own, but for now only gets a potted biography. The son of a Scottish Newfoundland merchant, Cormack was born in Fishy St. John's in 1796. He was educated in Scotland under the tutelage of the famous Professor Robert Jameson. He returned to Newfoundland in 1820 after the death of his mother to settle the family affairs there, and somewhere in this time, the madness of grief and imperial masculinity combined to make him determined to become the first white man to walk across the island's 500-mile-wide interior. Governor Hamilton, whose job it was to make sure fish got made and fish got shipped and no American or French ships did something they weren't supposed to do, had no interest in the idea and refused any financial aid or personnel. In his seminal work on settler colonialism and the elimination of the native, Patrick Wolfe notes, quote, "the insatiable dynamic whereby settler colonialism always needs more land." But in the case of Newfoundland, the powers that be only faced the water. So Cormac had to pay for his own help, and that came in the form of Joseph Sylvester, or Sylvester Joe. There's a debate about his name. I'm going to call him Joseph Sylvester here, but leaving room for other people to call him Sylvester Joe. Joseph Sylvester was a Mi'kmaq man from the island's south coast who knew the interior like the lines on his palm. Sylvester had his own words for places. His people were part of the Wabanaki, or Dawnland Confederacy, named for its front row seat for beautiful Atlantic sunrises. The Confederacy was formed in the 1680s and comprised the 5 major Algonquin nations of the eastern seaboard: the Abenaki, the Passamaquoddy, the Penobscot, Maliseet, and Mi'kmaq. Slide. Sylvester was from Mi'kma'ki, part of this confederacy, and in Mi'kmaq-Wismik, the island of Newfoundland was called Uktahumkuk, or Land of Fog, which is certainly more accurate than calling a place that was home to people for thousands of years new found. Uktahumkuk lay at the northern border of Mi'kma'ki, the domain of islands, as Charles Marchand puts it, that formed their territory. Sylvester's ancestors had been coming to its southern coast and canoeing into the interior to hunt and trap for centuries. Setting out from the coast in September of 1822, Cormac and Sylvester reached the first vista over the supposedly unknown interior a week later. Cormac, ever the romantic, was in raptures. "The hitherto mysterious interior lay unfolded below us," he wrote, "a boundless scene, emerald surface, a vast basin, an ocean of undulating forest." They walked for weeks, seeing no other human being. Cormac set about naming places. Slide. George IV Lake after the monarch, Bathurst Lake after the colonial secretary, Wilson's Lake after a friend at the Edinburgh Bar, the Jameson Mountains and Lake after his mineralogist mentor, who taught him how to look at rocks and see time. Mount Sylvester, named after his guide. Mount Misery, for the place he and Sylvester nearly died, blizzard-bound and starving, as though he wanted to curse that place, as though it was the place's fault. Sylvester kept his charge alive for over 50 long days, showing him how to dry his feet by the fire to prevent sores, helping navigate, passing on remedies, hunting and dressing the caribou they ate, while Cormac scribbled his grandiose plans to tame and commodify the herd in his water-stained journal. But even Sylvester found himself cold, exhausted, and hungry by the time they met with a mixed Mi'kmaq and Innu family camped deep in the interior. James John was the man's name. His wife's name was not recorded. James John was an Innu man from what we would call Labrador, what he would call Nitassinan. And he had come to the island of Newfoundland as a young man to hunt and trap. The John family shared their meat with them, and after Cormac begged, shared their songs. They sang of seal and birds and hunting and stars, as the Milky Way, which James John's Mi'kmaq wife would have called Skidway da Mudjawati, or Ghost Road, stretched above their heads, with apologies to Mi'kmaq language teacher Curtis Michael, because I don't think I said that quite right. They told creation stories set in place and stretching back into time. While Europeans were losing their minds trying to reckon with a world that was suddenly and undeniably older than the 6,000 years set out in the Bible, the Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Beothuk had managed to pass down place-based stories over dozens and dozens of generations that told them, you've been here for a very, very long time, and the earth has been here longer still. Cormac, meanwhile, was turning hunks of rock over in his hand and stuffing them in his rucksack. adding daily to his already cumbersome pack the weight of speckled greenstone, iridescent feldspar, and soapy green serpentine. Before they left to continue on, James John drew two maps on birch bark for the travel-weary men. These rough wayfinding maps indicated the lakes and ponds and portage paths between them, because a canoe really was the only way to sensibly traverse the interior of the island in any season but the frozen winter. Cormac, much to Joseph Sylvester and James John's likely bemusement, appeared to have never heard of a paddle. They headed out again on foot. Both men were half dead by the time they saw St. George's Bay on the island's west coast. "I hailed the glance of the sea as home," Cormac wrote at the end of his 500-mile journey. Here, they relied on the generosity of Mi'kmaq and Jersey settlers who shared their food stores and their hearths. Cormac's working map was little more than the rough scrawl of an amateur wayfinder, a dotted line from one known sea border to another, drawn upon a chart of Newfoundland from Steele and Goddard, chart sellers to the Admiralty East India Company. Of James John's birch bark maps and Cormac's line, I know which one I'd rather have if I found myself having to wayfind in the Newfoundland wilderness. Cormac marked his and Sylvester's bivouacs with simple tent shapes and numbered the places where useful rocks had been found. The rudimentary path he traced did not capture the extent of their real journey, where thousands of lakes and bogs had forced constant circumnavigation, which Cormac estimated added at least 100 more miles to the trek. And while subsequent maps called this path Mr. Cormac's track, showing the literal corridor of knowledge he created across the middle of the island, the map is actually full of Joseph Sylvester's knowledge as well, that included places that Cormac himself had never been. New slide. But which Sylvester knew were river roads that would lead him to his South Coast home. So these lines here and these lakes, Cormac never came near them. So they're obviously drawn from Joseph Sylvester's knowledge and memory. So yeah, and because they were his roots home to Mwapekek, which means Middle River, and is still a Mi'kmaq First Nation to this very day. Cormac stayed on the west coast long enough to regain his strength, then hightailed it to London on the last boat of the season, and prepared his notes on his walk for publication in a rented flat in London, sending them and his hunks of rock to his old mentor, Professor Robert Jameson, who saw the account published in the Edinburgh Philosophical Journal, wedged between a report on the trachea of emus in New Holland and celestial calculations for Edinburgh's meridian. Over the next 5 years, Cormac would develop a new obsession: the saving of the Beothuk. He returned to Newfoundland in 1827 and founded what he called the Beothuk Institute, declaring to the small group of assembled great and good in the town of Twillingate that, new slide, and again, we now stand on the nearest point of the New World to Europe, to consider the condition of this invaded and ill-treated first occupiers of the country. Britons have trespassed here to be a blight and a scourge to a portion of the race. A defenseless and once independent tribe of men have been nearly extirpated from the earth without hardly any inquiry how or why. Armed with more birch bark maps and 3 more guides from the Innu, Abenaki, and Mi'kmaq First Nations, he headed back out into the interior, where he found the ruins of what had clearly once been a thriving Beothuk settlement. Abandoned mammotiques and vapor tents, empty storehouses, and long expanses of deer fence, forsaken and going to decay. 2 centuries of settler violence, disease, and dispossession, amplified by the uncertainties of the seasons and the precarity of life on a subarctic island, had taken a profound toll. The small party spent, quote, several melancholy days inspecting the ruins, and Cormac noted that the Innu man, John Stevens, whose people considered the Beothuk their closest cousins, was particularly overcome. During this second trek, Cormac ran head-on into the story that David Buchan had drawn, coming upon the sepulchre of Nonosabasset and his infant child into which Buchan had placed the coffin of Demasduit almost a decade before. Very likely to the horror of his Indigenous guides, Cormac defiled the sepulchre and removed Nonosabasut and Demasduit's skulls, alongside the grave goods that had been placed beside them, stuffing them into his pack as though they were chunks of granite. It is to be lamented that now, Cormac wrote in his report of his second expedition, when we have taken up the cause of a barbarously treated people, so few should remain to reap the benefit of our plans for their civilization. And he posts the lot of it all to Robert Jameson, who places the skulls and the grave goods in his world-famous museum, which was later integrated into the University of Edinburgh's museum before they were sent on to the National Museum of Scotland. They spent 200 years in storeroom boxes before the skulls, before finally being repatriated, largely thanks to the campaign of Chief Michel Joe of Mwapakek First Nation in 2020. The grave goods are still there. It was around the time of Cormac's return, hollow-cheeked and haunted, that he learned that there was one young Beothuk woman who might yet become the object of his noble rescue. They called her Nancy April, after the month she had been captured by whites 5 years before, but her real name was Shauna Didit. He arranged to have her taken from the house of her master in Notre Dame Bay to his own home in St. John's. He tore pages from his merchant ledger book and placed 2 pencils, one red and one gray, on the desk beside her. It was here, between January and May of 1829, in a room that overlooked the bustling port of St. John's and the evergreen hills across the harbor, that Shauna Didit drew maps of her own. Last map. Shauna Didit was born around 1800, somewhere in the western half of the island of Newfoundland, and in 1823, when she was 22 years old, she and her family left the place that Buchan had called Red Indian Lake and made the very risky journey to the coast in search of shellfish for food. Along the way, her uncle and cousin were shot dead, and her father drowned, fleeing whites when attempting to cross a half-frozen river. She, her sister, and her mother managed to reach the Bay of Exploits, but soon found themselves staring down the barrel of a trapper's gun. He took them captive and brought them to the house of the man he worked for, John Peyton. Her mother and sister soon died of tuberculosis. Shauna Didit remained at Peyton's home in domestic servitude until Cormac removed her in late 1827. And yes, this is the same John Peyton who had killed her aunt and uncle. At Peyton's house, she created dozens of artworks and handicrafts, most of which are lost. And those who knew her said that she was always happiest when, quote, a pencil was in her hand. The story maps that Shauna Didit created after she arrived at Cormac's house in St. John's in 1829 are part of a series of 10 extant sketches, which constitute the only first-hand account we have of Beothuk lifeways and culture. Unlike maps made in conversation with European explorers and invaders, for instance, the famous map of the Pacific Islands drawn by Tupaya, Shauna Didit's were made for no such purpose and seem mostly a means by which she could tell a story, one that was deeply rooted in the place where it happened. They perhaps can be seen as map biographies or as testaments that actively refuse to be legible and transmittable, that actively refuse cartography, in other words. And they are certainly what Indigenous cartographer Anita Lucchesi would call anti-colonial maps. In any case, taken together, her drawings are, as literary scholar Fiona Pollock puts it, some of the most extraordinary surviving artifacts of the North American colonial era and deserve far closer scrutiny than they have yet received. They're very faint because they're very old and they were done on pencil on a merchant's ledger book and not taken particularly good care of for quite some time. She filled the ledger pages with images of women dancing, of ceremonial staffs, of white devils, of food storage techniques, a lot of food storage techniques, while answering Cormac's questions in her particular brand of Newfoundland English. What songs did the Beothuk sing, he asked her. What beliefs did they have in the afterlife? How many had died and how many remained? Next slide. In a wonderful reversal of gaze, she sketched Cormac's house and the desk upon which she did her drawings. Next slide. One of her sketches depicts the incredible journey she and her family undertook to a place called Badger Bay, which is at the bottom of the Bay of Exploits. Every bit as epic and significantly more harrowing than the one for which Cormac became so much better known. These are the same maps, but this one has been darkened and some of the noise has been removed. But I wanted to show you both in particular because of the way that she's angled the ledger book to continue her map. She took no soundings, made no measurements, used no pre-existing chart. Instead, she drew from memory, from the fact of having made the journey many times, from the stories of those who made it before her. Like James John's birch bark maps, hers was a knowledge gained as much by paddling as by walking, refusing to follow a Pelehoalfa, the land-centeredness of colonialism. Shauna Didit used her canoe to navigate the rivers that ran like veins and arteries through the body of the land. She portaged it from pond to pond in a carefully drawn, dotted path. She and her family island hopped, marked the way the land and water changed in the seasons, encountering the ever-shifting climate of the island, snow and sleet one day, rain and sun the next. A place where in the morning a river could be a frozen road, but in the afternoon a raging, impassable torrent. One of the Beothic's earliest historians, the geological surveyor James P. Howley, writing in 1915, described Shauna Didit's maps as being defined by, quote, the entire absence of anything like a regular scale. But as contemporary cartographer Matthew Spark persuasively argues, Shauna Didit's maps actually accurately reflect the, quote, uneven possibilities of travel across an uneven landscape. Shauna Didit formed knowledge, as Tim Ingold puts it, quote, along paths of movement in the weather world. Upon her drawings, Cormac scrawled his cruel arithmetic, based on Shauna Didit's own reckoning. How many of her people had been murdered or starved, and how many remained? 28, then 12, now 1. Next slide. Her wider world, meanwhile, looked very different to the one that British imperialists were slowly drawing of the Northwest Atlantic. Her borders were not theirs. And although European texts created an image of the Red Indians as isolated, retiring, and cut off from the rest of civilization, as well as other indigenous people, Shauna Didit most likely knew her neighbors very well. Many of her people had left their own shrinking territory to go to Mi'kma'ki or Nitassinan, navigating between the lines that colonizers drew and the changing territories of indigenous nations and confederacies. Using the transit of Venus, which Cook famously observed from Tahiti as he navigated with the help of Tupaya's map, and other calculations, Europeans were fixing standardized lines on the globe. But Shauna Didit's lines of connection, travel, and exchange were adaptive, relational, and ever-changing. Her stars told different stories. Perhaps the most extraordinary story she told is this. Incredibly, these maps recount Buchan's 2 trips upriver as Shauna Didit witnessed them. First, at the age of 11, when the Marines were killed. She drew her people's sacred lake and the paths of flight they took across the ice. She drew the killing of the Marines and, in an inset I can only think of as intentionally comical, she drew a close-up of one of their heads on a pole, which she said they danced around. So that circle is the dance that they danced around the head on the pole, the kind of cartoonish head. Then she drew her version of the murder of her uncle and the kidnap of her aunt by the John Peyton and his posse in March of 1819, insisting that a second Beothic man was also killed that day. John Peyton was actually tried for this crime and found not guilty, but there was never any mention in the white records of a second man being killed. She drew a figure holding an infant, which I don't have inset, but it's there. Damazdowit's child who perished, Shauna Didit told Cormac, just 2 days after their mother was taken. The crisscrossed paths she charted across the lake are very reminiscent of Buchan's own mapping, both committing to permanency the temporary mark of footprints on snow. Finally, she drew the same link at a different moment. Next slide. And this one's very hard to pick out. When she watched from the tree line as David Buchan and his men plodded up the river once more, this time dragging Demastuit's coffin. She drew a small red bundle to show the precise place where Demastuit's baby had died at B. Taking care to ensure their brief life and small death made the mark on history she felt it deserved. Like Buchan's map, Shauna Didit's relays a landscape shaped by story and feeling as much as by terrain. Cormac became, in the words of archaeologist Donald Hawley, the Beothuk's first, last, and only ethnographer. But it was a role that he did not take very seriously. He never published any account of his interviews with Shauna Didit. His notes on the conversations he had with her are on the back of other papers, business papers, and much is borderline illegible. Much of it consists of questions he was going to ask. Presumably, he wrote the answers down on papers long lost. There's an indication that Shauna Didit drew many more maps and images, but these, alongside any other better notes or reports that Cormac wrote, appear to be lost forever or long since destroyed. And there is a story here that I don't have time to tell. Cormac left Newfoundland for England in April of 1829, rushing back to London in an attempt to save his merchant business from bankruptcy, which was like the third time his merchant business almost went bankrupt, because I think he was just not very good at much. But anyway, but then, by then, Shauna Didit had grown gravely ill with the same disease that had killed her mother and her sister and her aunt and so many other of her people. By May, she was taken into the care of Dr. William Carson at the Naval Hospital in St. John's. By the close of June, she was dead from tuberculosis. Carson, at the request of Cormac, removed her scalp and her skull and prepared them as specimens. The rest of her body was buried in a pauper's grave on the south side of the harbor, alongside hundreds of unnamed Marines and sailors who had the misfortune to die on the Newfoundland station. In September of that same year, Cormac penned her obituary. It ran in the Times and a handful of other newspapers in September of 1829. This interesting female lived for 6 years a captive among the English, he wrote, and when taken notice of laterally, exhibited extraordinary mental talents. She was, he said, part of, quote, a primitive nation, once claiming rank as a portion of the human race, who have lived, flourished, and become extinct in their own orbit. The last of the Red Indians, he declared her, because settlers didn't know of any others, and when white men didn't know something, it seemed to mean it did not exist. Shauna Didit was certainly not the last of the Beothuk, and the application of extinction to any group of human beings is a fundamentally racist concept. But it is undeniably true that in the years following her death, any remaining Beothuk on the island dispersed to join other Indigenous communities, especially the Innu and the Mi'kmaq. And by the end of the 19th century, no person remained who could speak the language or recall any significant aspects of the culture insofar as we can tell. The death of the Beothuk world was near totalizing, and some legal scholars and historians have begun to label what happened a genocide. In all of his scrawling, in all of his efforts to desecrate her body and preserve her as an interesting specimen, as he called her, Cormac never thought to ask Shauna Didit what her people called their homelands. And this absence marks the map of the island to this very day. As one tourist wrote in his hunting guide to Newfoundland, his British hunting guide to Newfoundland in 1907, the average Englishman imagines it to be a little bit of a place somewhere near the North Pole. But if he has been to school, he will have learned that it is our oldest colonial possession, famous for codfish, caribou, and national debts. So here is my last map. For anyone who might need it, again, you can click one more time, and hasn't already looked it up on their phones, here is where in the world the island of Newfoundland is. As you can see, it's significantly south of Scotland, much larger than a bit of a place, and nowhere near the North Pole. Every inch of the island's coastline was eventually surveyed as little boxes of maritime charts, next slide please, were stitched together into a full knowledge of the island's coast. But Newfoundland, England's first overseas colony and the place that produced the fundamental resource for enslavement and for imperial expansion, has been largely forgotten by imperial historians working in Britain. This is not to discount the growing and increasingly sophisticated scholarship on Newfoundland coming out of Atlantic Canadian studies, which has supported and enriched this lecture immeasurably. But when viewed from this side of the Atlantic, from what we like to call the metropole, Newfoundland, like many other islands, as Apelihuafan argues about the islands of the Pacific, is viewed with an attitude of belittlement. But it is, of course, empire itself that made places like Newfoundland hinterlands and chose to unknow them. It was imperial culture that narrated them as empty places, rocky and broken, choked by ice and ravaged by wind. In the books and maps of imperialists, places like Newfoundland were understood as spaces that robust, if foolhardy men trekked across, and from which mineral and animal resources could be extracted, not as places of networked paths and connections where people lived. They were seen, and arguably continue to be seen, as marginal and peripheral, even if to Shauna Didit, this place was the center of the world, even if the biomass that was pulled out of its ocean fed, quite literally, a global network of exploitation. And however much historians have challenged the binary of core and periphery in favor of webs and networks and circuits, I think that these hierarchies of insignificant and significant places still haunt our histories. In the present, British historians appear to have consigned Newfoundland history to the world of Canadian history, which they in turn also ignore a great deal, even though my father was born in the British Dominion of Newfoundland, and Newfoundland history did not become anything other than British history until the former country became a province of Canada in 1949. The history of this overlooked corner of empire lurks in the catalogues and the displays of almost every British museum. Some of the grave goods stolen by Cormac are still in the storeroom of the National Museum of Scotland, while two others, described as being taken from the chief's tomb, are at the British Museum. A model canoe that Shauna Didit made, which is just absolutely beautiful, stitched with spruce root sinew and lacquered with red ochre and seal fat, sits under a warmed-down light at the National Maritime Museum's Atlantic Gallery in Greenwich. Her name is misspelled, but at least it's there. One of the last great auks, collected by Joseph Banks in Newfoundland, guards the door to the Hunterian Museum at the Royal College of Surgeons. For a time, Shauna Didit's bones and the auks were in company, but her skull, which had been sent to the Royal College of Surgeons, is presumed to have been destroyed when it was hit by an incendiary device in May of 1941. I'm not convinced that it was destroyed, but that is another story. Sujit Sivasundaram suggests that islands run ahead of history, that they are the places where the experiments and horrors of modernism and imperialism first get tried out, and where the consequences are first, and because of the closed nature of island ecologies, most acutely felt. Certainly, the island of Newfoundland bears out these observations. By the 1960s, freezer trawlers were dragging the cold corals on the seabed, pulling up cod on a previously unimaginable scale. By the 1980s, fishermen, whose local knowledge was as sharp as it had been since their ancestors had informed Cook and Lane, were warning of a catastrophic collapse in the fish stocks. In 1992, the commercial cod fishery in what had once been the richest fishing ground on planet Earth was declared in moratorium, and it remains so to this day. Instead, we've learned that shallow ocean shelves are not just ideal cod breeding grounds. Their deep sea borders tend to hold immense reservoirs of petroleum, and oil rigs now dot the island's coasts. Meanwhile, some land maps have turned to water maps as sea levels and water levels rise. The grave of Shauna Didit's aunt and uncle are now submerged, thanks to flooding caused by hydro dams. And with storm surges increasing and Arctic glaciers melting, Cook and Lane's coastlines are being redrawn by water, wind, and ice, forces which continuously defy our attempts to know them. Thank you very much. Bad news.
That was an absolutely brilliant lecture, Julia. That was so interesting, and I'm sure I can see people nodding as I say that was a truly fantastic contribution to our lecture series. Thank you so much. I know there will be questions from the floor, so let's open up. Wave your hand if you would like to put a question to Julia. And I'm going to hand the mic because we need to pick you up for the Zoom audience as well. I think I can probably get to you that way.
Hi, it was very, very interesting to go from unknowing to knowing about this area and this place. My question is to do with Ireland, because I, perhaps ignorantly, always thought that Ireland was Britain's first overseas colony. So when you started the lecture, you talked about a lot of Irish people being involved in settling and working. Was that... were they people coming from a colonized Ireland at that point?
So thank you for allowing me to disambiguate. Oh, I should have said over ocean, because absolutely, Ireland would be the overseas colony if you count that strip of water as a sea, which it is a sea. So what I meant is its first transatlantic or transoceanic colony. As for the Irish people who settled Newfoundland, so Newfoundland was settled by about 50% of people from the southwest of England, the West Country, and 50% of people from the southeast of Ireland, who would kind of be picked up as indentured servants as the ships made their way across the Atlantic. And the majority of the indentured servants in the Newfoundland fishery were Irish. So yeah, thank you for allowing me to clarify though.
I mean, that was just the most beautiful and affecting lecture. I think it's one of the most of both of those things I've ever heard. And I wondered if you could perhaps say a little bit more about your own journey into this material for us.
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah. So I'm from Newfoundland, in case you didn't already, know. And I didn't do a lot of Newfoundland history. I did my undergraduate there. I didn't do a lot of Newfoundland history, much to my own now deep chagrin. And I came to this kind of via Lydia, the book, The Disappearance of Lydia Harvey, where I had started using family history research techniques to get at the life of somebody who I had no relation to. And so I started then thinking about my own family and turning the lens on my own family history. And then that quite quickly got me into the literature on settler colonialism, and I was really struggling to place Newfoundland in that frame. And then I started revisiting these stories. So anybody online, and there's at least one person in the audience from Newfoundland, because she's my sister, knows the story of Shauna Did It and the Beothic, you know, like almost by rote, because it's really kind of part of the kind of social studies canon that we learn. But so when I revisited those stories, I realized, gosh, it's about time to reframe them and retell them, because in those stories, Shauna Did It just sort of appears as this kind of abject symbol of colonial guilt, the last of the Beothic. And so the more I read, the more I realized that before I could start thinking about my own family's position within all of this, I actually had to revisit the fundamental narratives first. And so that led me to here.
Thank you. It's an extraordinary lecture, really. I was wondering how much Newfoundland in this way is a unique instance, how much of this is personal detail of the sort of cultural history and imperial history there in Newfoundland, or how much this story sort of figures into a wider history of settler colonialism also within Labrador, within Nova Scotia, within New England and the Maritimes broadly.
Yeah, I think so. On the one hand, you're kind of tempted when you first look at this to be like, this is really sui generis, right? Like this doesn't quite fit with a lot of narratives. But the deeper I read, the more I realized that it does. It just changes those narratives a little bit. in some views, Newfoundland was just thought of as a part of greater New England, right? Like a kind of northern, distant part of New England. And of course, when you look at it in the frame of Atlantic Canadian studies or Gulf studies, Gulf of St. Lawrence studies, it then starts to connect up with the militarization of that area, with the treaty relationships that they had with other Indigenous peoples. So I don't think it is unique at all in some ways, but its case study kind of begs us to re-examine some of these other places that haven't been properly kind of integrated into British imperial history, because I think it really needs to be, because they all have different kind of elements. And in particular, you know, I found settler colonial studies, while obviously like a really rich kind of key to unlock some of this stuff, I kept going, okay, but what happens when there's no topsoil? What happens when there's no land, when there's no farming? And those sorts of questions. So I'm still kind of working out how unique it is in that frame. And I'd love people to accost me afterwards and tell me what you think the answer to that question is.
Thanks, Julia. It's a really fantastic paper, but it's also really difficult to listen to. You know, from the Great Orcs onwards, the whole thing is difficult. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about, was it difficult to research as well for you?
Yeah, very much so. Somebody who, a colleague of mine, I was telling about this, and he said, you know, it sounds like you're writing an elegy. And in a way I am, because it's really hard, like when you're from this place. And I don't think I quite realized how deeply ecologically affected the island was by imperialism until I started looking at this. And that's my own fault, because historians have been trying to explain this for some time. It's just I wasn't listening. Because there is this sort of myth that Newfoundland is this beautiful, untouched wilderness that I think a lot of people would still believe back home too. But in another way, it's kind of coming from a perspective of hope, in that, you know, if we can reframe these stories and stop talking about these kind of top-down imperial belonging and start thinking, okay, well, what do we owe this place now? And I think history is the first step in that. So it's kind of a combination, like what gets me through some of it is thinking, well, telling this story can actually help point the way to a more responsible future, including one where oil rigs are not the only way that we sustain our economy.
More questions. Do catch my eye. Anybody else wants to?
Thank you so much, Julia, for this talk. There are so many things that I want to discuss with you. And I also just want to say, for everyone who doesn't know, that it's really, really, really hard to do research on the Beothuk. There's like almost no documentation or anything. And so the fact that you've been able to tell us so much about like individual people and the way that they lived is like truly remarkable. So yeah, I need to learn your ways. But I guess I'm curious about how Captain Cook made the map, and you mentioned that he learned a lot about the coastline from talking to fishermen, and I'm curious if you have found anything about him talking to Indigenous people and getting help from them too, or like the kind of maps that you showed us people drew. I ask very selfishly because I've been trying to figure this out for a long time.
I'll try to answer it because I'm not sure. So I don't know anything about surveying, so I get very confused about like the triangulating measurements and stuff. So I definitely can't answer that part. The reason I say he asked the fishermen is because when you look in like the journal notes, it says like fishermen tell me blah blah blah. It also has like funny stuff like under provisions it will say nothing but fish. They may well have been speaking to Mi'kmaq folks who were along the northwest coast, but because they mostly had anglicized surnames and they weren't necessarily identified as such. So John Peyton had a few Mi'kmaq people working for him, for instance, and like when you start looking, you realize that they're settling everywhere there, and that they are sharing knowledge. But I'm not sure. And Joseph Banks got really kind of pissed off because he really wanted to go and meet some Beothuk, but he couldn't find them. He's like, oh, I haven't met with them. And then he gets sick and doesn't end up getting off the boat after a certain point. And then Cook himself gets redeployed, so he doesn't actually finish the map. It's Michael Lane who's far less remembered, who finishes the map. And the way I told this story, he didn't sort of just sail around. He did it in chunks because, of course, he had to work with periods of time when it wasn't, pack ice wasn't in, right? So he'd go, I think it was over 3 or 4 years. But yeah, I don't know. Let's talk more about it, because I'm trying to find out too.
I've noticed you.
I want to thank you, first of all, Julia. It's very enlightening. I'm just a first-year undergrad, so it's adding context to what was once a very empty island. My question was about the farming, and well, the fisheries and its connection to slavery, and I didn't know about that before. And I wanted to ask if you could talk more about the scale of exports and whether this was, just trying to get a timeline in my head, whether this was whilst it was still under the British Empire or post-independence, of scale of that.
So Newfoundland doesn't get responsible government until 1832. So this entire period, it's under direct British rule that I'm talking about. In terms of the scale, enormous. So I'm still working on the exact numbers. If you want a very boring but incredibly thorough book, I'd recommend Harold Innis's The Cod Fisheries, which was published in 1960, maybe in the 40s. And some of those numbers are there, but the scale is enormous. It's one of the biggest productive industries in the world for centuries in terms of its export. So yeah, it's enormous. And of course, salt fish is still an enormous part of Caribbean diet to this very day, delicious part of the diet. And they would then send the cheapest kind of rum to Newfoundland. So we have a tradition of drinking very cheap Caribbean rum. So there's a wonderful food history that, in fact, like there's a fair amount of folks now from the Caribbean in Newfoundland who are starting to do some of that kind of cultural exchange and history. So yeah, it's fascinating.
Thanks, Julia. Wonderful paper. Interesting to hear about tuberculosis as the kind of thread that runs through it for the encounters that you're tracing out. I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about that and like what impact it's having, and whether that's just one amongst many kind of disease encounters, if you like, or whether we could do a kind of more than human story that paid more attention to the viruses and the bacteria that are part of this story.
Oh, that's a really good question. So on the tuberculosis stuff, that's coming, the deep dive. And it's a little controversial amongst archaeologists and historians. Some people will say it's tuberculosis that killed the Beothuk, to put it really crudely, like kind of in earlier debates terms. But increasingly that idea is being challenged in that, they're not living in dense societies. It doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, tuberculosis was mowing down white settlers as well. And it was one of the leading causes of death in Newfoundland right up into the 1950s. And in fact, there's whole sort of papers about like why is Newfoundland so full of tuberculosis. The more I read, the less convinced I am that I think the people who came into contact with whites, tuberculosis seemed to be a particular cause of death. But I'm more and more convinced that it was starvation mostly that killed most people in Beothuk camps. And I'm starting to trace the number of instances in the archive where it's noted that white people have stolen from or destroyed food stores. Because when I say food stores, I mean like a giant building filled with 300 caribou haunches, like enough to feed a huge number of people for an entire winter. If you destroy that or steal from it, I just think it's far more likely to have been a factor. So I think this is, for the people listening online, if there's people who know this literature well, this is something that I really need to think a little bit more about. But I agree, I'm trying to bring in the more than human world in terms of the animals and non-animals' life, but I haven't thought about viruses, and so I will. Thank you, Lucy.
Thanks. We've seen effectively the genocide of the Beothuk through your talk today. I think I'm right in saying that the Mi'kmaq peoples are still in existence, still living in this area, in the island. There's obviously been cultural erosion, to use a phrase, of their culture as well. How far are the people themselves investigating this and tracking down their heritage? And is there also a mapping culture there to be investigated?
So the answer is enormously. Mi'kmaq communities in Newfoundland are in the middle of a major cultural revival that is just absolutely wonderful. Chief Michel Joe, who I mentioned earlier, other people like Calvin White, who have been campaigning for decades and decades and decades to have the Mi'kmaq of Newfoundland recognized, have finally getting that recognition. So when Newfoundland joined Canada, the terms of union denied the existence of any Indigenous people, both in Newfoundland and in Labrador. So I've also left out the story of Labrador. There's a whole other thing that's very much entwined with this one, but an hour is an hour. So they denied, despite the fact that especially Labrador has enormous numbers of Indigenous people, specifically Innu and Inuit. And so, but specifically on the island of Newfoundland, Mi'kmaq communities are in the middle of a major cultural revival, including rediscovering their language. There are some people who never lost the language, but they're starting to teach the younger generation. Mi'kmaq artists are starting to get a lot more attention. It's really, really wonderful to see. And I guess it goes back to your question about hope and about how hard it is to write this, because I am also writing it in the context of seeing Indigenous people on the island finally get recognition, and so that is a hopeful story. You're welcome.
Thank you so much for such a rich talk. So I'm also from Newfoundland, and I'm so excited that I was able to come, and I feel sad how little of this story we were told. Yeah. And that speaks to the sort of social studies and the sanitization of Shauna did it, but also the Beothuk story. And so being here today and being able to hear more about that and hear your work was really inspiring. So thank you for that. I have two questions. So, and I should say also, I'm not a historian, so I'm a bit of an interloper in this space. So first question is sort of about colonial relations and perceptions of Newfoundland from the British side. And I wondered to what extent the ignorance that was sort of seen, and you gave some examples of sort of the colonizers ignoring, they're not going to send a patrol, for example, to stop violence. To what extent that is sort of willing, or witting, knowing ignorance, or to what extent it's sort of, we're really busy, there's a lot going on, and it's unknowing or unwitting. And I'm curious, in thinking about your source materials that you've looked at, sort of where, at least from your perceptions, what that seems to be in terms of the relationship. And then my second question is just whether you have any plans to give this talk in Newfoundland. Yeah, because I want to tell everybody I know to go.
I'm hoping some people are listening online. So on the first question, remind me the first question. The witting or unwitting. It's hard to put your finger on. The third thing I'd say is they were also really cheap. Like, they didn't want to spend money. And yeah, I think it goes back to that idea of the work camp. And when I say it was a work camp, I don't mean that vibrant, culturally rich Newfoundland villages were work camps. I mean, that's how they were being seen and administered sometimes by the British government. I cannot imagine, I mean, the letters are there in the colonial secretary's letter book. He read them. These begging letters, like they knew what was happening. So I can't ever sort of let them off on we're busy sort of thing. I think they just didn't care that much. The Beothuk were seen as a very small population. They'd long since given up on having any kind of trade relationship. They weren't interested in the land, so there was no impetus for treaty negotiations. The Beothuk had no interest in treaty negotiations. Every time there was an encounter, it seemed pretty clear they did not have any desire to broker a treaty with whites. And so I think it's a combination of factors, but it is part of a larger story of a kind of increasing disregard. If you're interested in it in the 20th century, so when the price of fish collapses in the 1920s, Newfoundland plunges into dire economic straits, and they're put under commission of government in the 1930s. And a historian, Declan Cullen, has looked at the material from this commission of government, specifically looking at the way white Newfoundlanders were racialized by British officials, including tuberculosis, including being inbred and imbecilic and those sorts of things. So there's a whole wider story there, so good question. And yes, I am. I'm giving a much shorter version, well, not much shorter, we'll see how long I get, to the Trinity Historical Society. So I really want to give this talk to local history societies, because those are the folks I want to reach. And they couldn't, it's really interesting because, those sorts of local history societies are meant to kind of be, and they're mostly made up of white men over the age of 60, who are meant to be the kind of avatars for the culture war, the right-wing culture war. And the people I've encountered couldn't be more receptive and excited about the research that I'm doing, and they can't wait to hear more about it. And I can't wait to tell them. So yeah, August 18th, I'll be at Rocky's Oceanfront Lounge in Trinity, Newfoundland. I know, I can't wait.
I'd like to follow on from some of those things. To what extent, if any, was there intermarriage with the indigenous populations, the Membic, I assume particularly? If not, that makes it different from further north and the fur trade. And full disclosure, I'm part Swampy Cree.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, for the Mi'kmaq, huge amounts of intermarriage with both French settlers in Acadie and in Newfoundland, or the Acadian part of Newfoundland, and white English settlers and Irish settlers too. A lot of this went largely undocumented for a very long time, and it's only now during the cultural revival I already talked about that people are becoming more and more aware of their Indigenous heritage they weren't necessarily sure about or didn't know about. And that's messy. That's a really messy conversation that I don't have time to get into. But yeah, lots and lots and lots of intermarriage. In terms of the Beothuk, yes, as well, but we don't, they definitely intermarried with Mi'kmaq folks. There are some people who claim that they intermarried with white people. It's also very controversial, but there are people who have a bizarre faith in DNA to unlock the secrets of history, who have located Beothuk genes amongst people in people who are otherwise self-identify as white in North America. And there is one incredible story from 1911, 1915, somewhere around there. Frank Speck, the anthropologist Frank Speck, meets a woman named Santu in Maine, who claims that her father was Beothuk and is able to recall a Beothuk lullaby, which she sings into a wax cylinder, which still exists. And Beverly Diamond and John Hewson have written an incredible article called Santu's Song about that. So if you're interested in digging deeper, that's where you'd look. I hope I got those names right.
Thanks, Julia. Well, we're running quite low on time. I've got at least two more questions. No, I was going to say, why don't we scoop them both up together? And if anybody's got a question, just let me know.
Thanks. You said towards the end that you didn't believe that the skull was destroyed in the Royal College of Surgeons in a bomb. What do you think happened to it?
So,
Hold on, just catch this question as well.
Oh yes, let's gather.
I also echo everyone's thanks. I wanted to know a little more about how Cormac transitions from sort of unqualified explorer to unqualified protector. There's sort of a jump there.
Yes, excellent question. So on the question of Shauna Didit's remains, so we know, so William Carson sent the skull and the scalp to the Royal College of Physicians, which we know from a transfer book was transferred to the Royal College of Surgeons in 1938. From there, any physical record of it has disappeared. And the Royal College of Surgeons says that they presume it was destroyed alongside 2/3 of their specimen collection in 1941, May 11th, 1941 to be specific. However, when I went into the archives and started looking at the number of things that were destroyed, 2/3 of their human crania collection were not destroyed. So 2/3 of their specimen collection were, but most of that was non-human animals. And so and then a whole bunch was transferred to the Natural History Museum. Other bits and pieces were sent out to local museums because, of course, they were in complete, chaos mode at this point. In the middle of war, the building was incredibly, incredibly damaged. And so a lot of stuff got lost. So there is no definitive proof that the skull was destroyed. And the more I research this topic, the more aware I am of just how many lost, unnamed, sacred remains are kept in boxes and storage rooms with no labels, no context. And so I won't let it go yet, or ever. On Cormac, what a strange fellow. And I hope that I communicated my deeply ambivalent feelings about him. In Newfoundland now, as part of the, Newfoundland's kind of having its anti-colonial moment, and I welcome it. And as part of that, Cormac has kind of become a bit of a big baddie. And he deserves a lot of it. He robbed graves. He's responsible for people not being at rest. He invented this language of extinction that has haunted the Indigenous people of Newfoundland for centuries. Like he deserves all of it. But at the same time, it does take away some of the nuance that he was also, for his time, an imperial humanitarian with all the complexities that comes with. And at a time when the colonial government was completely ignoring the plight of the Beothuk, he was trying to make people aware of it. So it's just how he transitions from one to the other. He's a dilettante. So after he leaves Newfoundland, he goes to Australia, where he becomes the first white man to farm tobacco, well, I guess the first person to farm tobacco in Australia using convict labor. Then he gets into a spat with the local government there, leaves the land to the convicts, goes to New Zealand, buys land from the Maori just before the Waitangi Treaty, then loses all that land because he bought it, because he loses it when the Waitangi Treaty comes into effect. So then he leaves there, he sends a whole bunch of the extinct bird. Moa, thank you. Moa bones to the Horniman, so there's still a Moa bone at the Horniman, and so there's clippings everywhere that he kind of sends. And then he finally starts the California Adventurers Company, follows the gold to California, where he sends clippings of more plants that are at Kew, and then he heads up the coast following the gold to the Klondike, where he finally becomes an Indian agent on Vancouver Island. I can't remember exactly where, and dies after a scintillating, not right afterwards, but he performs a scintillating figure skating routine and then dies. So I haven't answered your question, but I hope I've shown you why I can't. Yeah.
Julia, thank you so much. What a fantastic ending to a really fantastic lecture. I've known Julia's work as a historian. I've known it for years, and it's always been fantastic and really interesting. And I was actually introduced to this project when she was talking about 2 years ago about her grandfather, as we mentioned, the grandfather based in Newfoundland. I thought that would be really interesting. Let's get her to give a lecture. But to see how it has grown from a kind of biography of her grandfather to this amazing paper that is so broad and so deep, and the questions here, every single question has poked at some really interesting little facet of what she said, and she's enlightened us on all of these points. It's been a real pleasure and a real highlight for us. So I'm sure you'll all want to join me in thanking Julia and saying congratulations.
Thank you.
And before you go, I will just make a plug for 2 more events that the RHS are doing that are coming up soon, and I think also promise to be absolutely fantastic. The Society is visiting Brunel University on the 23rd of May, and connected with that visit, we have Corinne Fowler presenting her fascinating work. I mean, you may well know her through her work for the National Trust and her decolonising work. She's talking on country walks through colonial Britain. I don't know if we're doing that online. You may need to get yourself to Brunel to be a part of that, or we may record it and release it as an audio recording. And then next big lecture in our series is Friday the 3rd of, oh no, that's not right, it should be the Wednesday the 3rd of July. It's Peter Frankopan, and he is going to be talking on the challenges and purposes of global history. We'll be back here at Mary Ward House for that. So do come along and join us. Do grab Julia and speech before we go, and there's tea and coffee for people who want it before they leave as well.
Thank you, everyone.